The dog had been lying beside the grave for 92 days, and not a single person in the small Colorado cemetery could explain why he refused to leave. At first, people assumed it was the simple, aching loyalty that dogs are known for, the quiet devotion that makes them wait at doors and windows long after footsteps fade. But this felt different, deeper somehow, like the animal was guarding something no human could see. The German shepherd's coat, once thick and glossy, had grown rough from the mountain wind, and every morning a thin layer of frost settled along his back before the rising sun melted it away. His name, according to the tag on the worn leather collar, was Shadow. The grave he watched belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes, United States Marine Corps. The headstone stood modest and clean beneath a tall pine tree at the edge of Silver Ridge Cemetery, about 30 miles outside Colorado Springs. Visitors came and went throughout the weeks, some leaving small American flags, others placing flowers that wilted slowly under the high-altitude sun, yet Shadow never reacted to them. He rarely barked, rarely moved, and never wandered more than a few feet from the stone marker. The groundskeeper, a quiet man named Harold Pierce who had worked the cemetery for nearly 20 years, noticed the dog the morning after the burial. At first he tried to coax him away with scraps of turkey from his lunchbox, kneeling carefully on the frosted grass. "Come on, boy," he murmured softly, extending a gloved hand. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes steady and thoughtful, but he didn't approach. Instead he glanced briefly toward the grave, then lowered his muzzle back onto his paws as if the conversation was already over. Word spread quickly through the nearby town. By the second week, people were stopping by just to see the dog who wouldn't abandon his Marine. Children whispered about him at school. Veterans who recognized the emblem on the headstone paused longer than usual, standing quietly with their hats in their hands. One elderly man who had served decades earlier in the Marine Corps saluted the grave and then the dog, his voice low and respectful when he said, "Semper Fi, partner." Still, Shadow stayed exactly where he was. The strange thing wasn't only the waiting. It was the way he watched the ground. Not the path or the visitors or the passing cars along the distant highway. His eyes remained fixed on a single point near the base of the headstone, as if he expected something beneath the soil to answer him. Some nights the wind swept through the cemetery hard enough to rattle the iron fence and bend the branches overhead, yet even then Shadow remained alert, ears lifting at sounds no one else could hear. Harold noticed something else too. The dog didn't sleep the way most animals do. He rested, yes, but his eyes never fully closed. Every few minutes they flicked toward that same patch of earth beside Michael Hayes's grave, patient and unwavering, like a sentry on duty. By the third month the townspeople had quietly accepted that the German shepherd wasn't simply mourning. He was waiting, and somewhere deep in the instinct that had once made him a Marine's partner, Shadow seemed absolutely certain that whatever he was waiting for had not yet arrived. Winter moved slowly through Silver Ridge Cemetery, and still the German shepherd remained beside the grave as if time itself had forgotten to move him. By early December, the temperature often dropped below 25 degrees Fahrenheit before sunrise, and the grass hardened into silver blades of frost that crunched softly beneath the boots of early visitors. Each morning Harold Pierce arrived shortly after 7, the old pickup truck rumbling through the narrow gravel path between rows of headstones. And every morning he saw the same quiet figure near the tall pine tree at the edge of the grounds. Shadow would be there already, sitting or lying close to the stone marked with the name Michael Hayes, his amber eyes fixed on the same patch of earth as if it held the answer to a question no human could understand. Harold began bringing extra food in his truck, setting down a metal bowl of water and a small portion of cooked chicken several feet away from the grave. Sometimes Shadow ate after Harold walked away. Sometimes he did not. But he never wandered farther than a few steps from the headstone. It was not the behavior of a lost pet. It was the behavior of a soldier standing watch. By the fourth month, the townspeople had grown used to the quiet guardian of the cemetery. Drivers slowed along the road that curved past the iron fence just to glimpse the dog beneath the pine tree. A few veterans began visiting on Sunday mornings, placing small American flags near the grave and nodding respectfully toward the animal. One retired Marine named Thomas Grady visited more often than the others. He had served nearly 25 years in the Corps, and even after retirement his posture still carried the unmistakable discipline of military life. The first time Thomas saw the dog, he stood there for a long moment, studying the way Shadow held himself, the straight back, the alert ears, the steady patience that did not belong to an ordinary stray. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was quiet and thoughtful. "You were trained," he said softly, kneeling a few yards away so the dog would not feel threatened. Shadow lifted his head slightly and watched him, calm but cautious. Thomas noticed the collar then, the worn leather and the small brass tag glinting in the morning light. He stepped closer, careful and slow, until he could read the name engraved on the metal. Shadow. Beneath it was a smaller line of text that caught his attention even more. K9 Unit. Thomas exhaled slowly, the pieces of the story beginning to fall into place. Somewhere in the past this dog had served beside the man whose name rested on that stone. Somewhere they had worked together closely enough that the bond between them had survived even death. Yet something about the situation did not sit right with him. It was the way Shadow watched the ground, not the path, not the people, but a single spot beside the base of the headstone. That was not grief. That was attention. As the weeks passed, Thomas continued to visit, sometimes bringing a thermos of hot coffee and sitting quietly on the nearby bench while the cold wind moved through the pine branches above them. One gray afternoon, he noticed something new. Shadow was standing instead of lying down, his nose close to the earth beside the stone marker. The dog sniffed the ground carefully, then stepped back, then returned again as if trying to confirm a scent that lingered beneath the soil. Thomas leaned forward, watching with growing curiosity. The dog was not restless. He was not digging out of boredom. He was studying that patch of ground with the same focus a trained tracker might use when following a trail. And in that moment Thomas realized something that made the quiet cemetery feel suddenly different. Shadow was not waiting for the past. He was waiting for something that had not happened yet. The following morning the sky above Silver Ridge Cemetery carried the pale gray color that often arrives before a Colorado snowstorm, and the air felt sharper than usual as Thomas Grady walked through the iron gate, with his coat collar pulled high against the wind. The ground beneath his boots was stiff with frost, each step producing a quiet crunch that echoed through the otherwise silent rows of headstones. From a distance, he could already see the familiar shape beneath the tall pine tree. Shadow was exactly where he had been the day before, sitting upright beside the stone that bore the name Michael Hayes, his ears raised and his body still, as if carved from the cold morning air. Thomas slowed his pace as he approached, studying the dog carefully. After decades in the Marine Corps, he had learned to read small signals in people and animals alike, the kind of details that revealed intention beneath calm surfaces. What he saw now made him certain that the German Shepherd was not simply grieving. Shadow's attention was focused again on that same narrow strip of ground beside the base of the headstone. The dog lowered his nose slowly to the soil, inhaled, then lifted his head and repeated the motion as if testing the scent again and again. Thomas crouched nearby, his breath visible in the cold air. "All right, boy," he murmured quietly, his voice calm and patient. "What are you trying to tell us?" Shadow did not look at him right away. The dog continued studying the earth, his nose tracing small arcs across the frozen grass, until finally, he paused at a specific point no larger than a dinner plate. Only then did he glance toward Thomas for a brief moment before returning his gaze to the ground. It was a look that felt less like a plea and more like an invitation to notice. Thomas leaned closer and brushed away a thin layer of frost with his gloved hand. The soil beneath it appeared ordinary at first glance, just dark winter dirt packed tightly by months of cold weather. Yet as he studied it longer, he realized the ground. There was slightly uneven, as if something beneath it had shifted or settled over time. Shadow noticed the movement immediately. The German Shepherd stepped forward and lowered his nose again, breathing in slowly before pawing once at the earth with deliberate care. It was not the frantic digging of an animal acting on instinct. It was controlled and purposeful, the motion of a trained dog signaling that something important lay hidden below. Thomas sat back on his heels, the realization spreading slowly through his mind. During his years in service, he had seen working dogs communicate with their handlers in subtle ways. Small gestures that meant far more than barking ever could. What Shadow was doing now was unmistakable. He was pointing something out. The wind moved softly through the pine branches overhead, carrying the faint scent of snow in the air while the cemetery remained quiet around them. Thomas looked from the disturbed patch of soil to the name etched into the headstone, then back to the dog whose eyes remained fixed on the same spot with unwavering patience. "You have been guarding this place for months," he said under his breath. Shadow's tail moved once against the frozen grass, slow and steady. In that moment Thomas felt the strange certainty that the German shepherd had never been waiting for comfort or mourning the past at all. Shadow had been standing watch over a secret, and whatever lay beneath that small patch of earth was the reason he had refused to leave. Thomas remained kneeling beside the grave for a long moment, studying the disturbed patch of soil while the cold wind moved quietly through the cemetery. The sky had grown darker since morning, heavy clouds rolling over the distant mountains as if the day itself were holding its breath. Shadow stood beside him without making a sound, his amber eyes calm and focused on the same place near the base of the headstone. Thomas reached forward again and brushed more frost away with his gloved hand, revealing the darker soil underneath. The ground felt firmer than he expected, packed tightly, as though something solid rested just beneath the surface. He glanced back at the dog. "You have been trying to show someone this for months," he said quietly. Shadow responded with a small shift of his weight, stepping closer until his nose hovered just inches above the earth. The movement was deliberate and patient, like a soldier guiding a teammate toward something important. Thomas slowly stood and looked around the quiet cemetery. The nearest grave was at least 20 yards away, and Harold's pickup truck was not scheduled to arrive for another hour. Snowflakes had begun drifting lightly through the air, small white specks turning lazily against the gray sky. For a moment Thomas hesitated. Disturbing the ground near a grave was not something anyone took lightly. Yet everything about the dog's behavior told him this was not random curiosity. Shadow had been guarding this place with the steady discipline of a trained working dog, the kind that only focused so intensely when they were certain of something. Thomas finally exhaled and walked to the small maintenance shed near the entrance of the cemetery. Inside, he found a narrow hand shovel leaning beside a rack of rakes and returned slowly to the pine tree where Shadow waited. The German shepherd watched him approach but did not bark or grow restless. Instead, the dog stepped aside slightly, giving Thomas space near the patch of uneven ground as if he understood exactly what the man intended to do. Thomas knelt again and pushed the shovel gently into the soil. The top layer broke away with a quiet crunch, the frozen earth loosening into small dark clumps. Shadow leaned forward, watching every movement with silent attention. Thomas worked slowly and carefully, digging only a few inches at a time. After several minutes, the shovel struck something firm with a dull metallic sound. He paused immediately, brushing the remaining dirt aside with his hands until a small rectangular object emerged from the soil. It was a weathered metal container about the size of a paperback book, its edges worn smooth by time underground. Thomas lifted it carefully, turning it over in his hands while the faint snowfall gathered along his coat sleeves. There was no lock on the lid, only a simple latch secured tightly against the metal surface. Shadow stepped closer and sniffed the container, his tail moving once in a slow, steady motion. The reaction confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect. Whatever was inside this container mattered to the dog. He opened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside rested a small cloth pouch folded neatly against the bottom of the box. Thomas unfolded the fabric slowly and felt his breath catch in the cold air. Lying inside the pouch was a military dog tag, the metal surface worn but still readable. The name engraved across the tag was unmistakable: Michael Hayes. Beneath the name was a second tag connected by a small chain. This one carried a different engraving: Shadow, K9 unit. Thomas held the two dog tags in his gloved hand while the light snowfall drifted silently through the cemetery, and for a long moment he simply stared at the names engraved into the metal. The first tag carried the name Michael Hayes along with the familiar markings of the United States Marine Corps. The second tag, smaller and slightly lighter, carried the name Shadow and the words K9 unit. The chain that connected them had rusted slightly from months beneath the soil, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. These tags had belonged together. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes toward the grave marker, then toward the German shepherd standing beside him. Shadow was watching the tags with calm attention, his ears forward and his posture steady, as if this moment had been expected all along. Thomas felt a quiet realization settle in his mind. The dog had not been guarding the grave itself. He had been guarding this container. He glanced again at the small metal box resting in the open dirt and noticed something he had not seen before. Beneath the cloth pouch was a folded piece of laminated paper pressed flat against the bottom of the container. He reached in and carefully lifted it out, brushing away the remaining grains of soil clinging to the surface. The paper was weathered but still readable, protected by the thin plastic covering around it. Thomas unfolded it slowly while Shadow remained beside him, the dog's nose lowering briefly as if recognizing the familiar scent. The paper held a printed photograph that had faded slightly with time. In the picture stood a younger Michael Hayes wearing a Marine Corps field uniform, one arm resting casually across the back of a German shepherd sitting proudly at his side. Shadow. The same bright amber eyes, the same alert ears, the same quiet strength that now stood beside the grave in the falling snow. Thomas could almost hear the laughter that must have existed the day the photo was taken. Beneath the photograph were several handwritten lines in dark ink, the writing steady and clear. Thomas read them carefully, his voice barely louder than the wind moving through the pine branches overhead. The note explained that the container had been placed beneath the soil intentionally months before the funeral. It described how Michael Hayes had prepared it during the final weeks before his deployment overseas, leaving instructions for it to remain hidden unless Shadow returned to this exact place. The message was simple but deeply personal. If Shadow ever brought someone to find the box, it meant the dog had remembered where it was buried. And if the dog remembered, it meant that the bond between them had survived everything that followed. Thomas lowered the paper slowly, his eyes drifting back toward the grave marker once more. Snowflakes settled softly along the engraved letters of Michael Hayes's name. For the first time since arriving at the cemetery that morning, Thomas understood the quiet certainty that had guided the German shepherd's watch. Shadow had not been waiting out of grief. He had been keeping a promise. And now that the hidden box had finally been uncovered, the dog stood calmly beside the open ground, as if the long duty he had carried for months was finally coming to an end. Thomas carefully folded the laminated note and held it for a moment while the snow continued to fall softly around the quiet cemetery. The cold air carried the faint scent of pine from the tall trees surrounding Silver Ridge Cemetery, and the only sound was the gentle whisper of wind moving through the branches above. Shadow stood beside him with calm patience, his eyes moving from the open container to the grave marker and back again, as if confirming that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Thomas placed the photograph and the dog tags back into the cloth pouch, then closed the small metal container and rested it on the ground beside him. His thoughts moved slowly through everything he had just discovered. Michael Hayes had prepared this container before leaving for deployment, burying it beneath the soil with the quiet hope that one day Shadow would return and guide someone to it. The idea felt deeply personal, almost like a message sent across time between a Marine and the partner who had served beside him. Thomas looked again at the German shepherd and noticed that Shadow's posture had begun to change in subtle ways. The tension that had held the dog steady for months seemed lighter now, as if the purpose that had kept him rooted to this spot had finally been fulfilled. The dog stepped closer to the grave marker and lowered his head briefly toward the stone, touching the cold granite with the tip of his nose. It was a small gesture, but one that carried the quiet weight of farewell. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as he watched. During his years in the Marine Corps, he had seen many examples of loyalty between soldiers, but the bond between a working dog and its handler was something rare and powerful. These animals were trained to trust completely, to follow commands without hesitation, and to protect their partners with unwavering dedication. That kind of connection did not disappear simply because time had passed or circumstances had changed. Shadow had carried that bond across months of cold nights and empty days, guarding a secret that only he remembered. Thomas gently filled the small hole again with the loose soil he had removed, packing the earth carefully until the ground looked nearly the same as before. He did not return the container beneath the soil. Instead, he held it in both hands, understanding now that it was meant to be found. When he finished smoothing the dirt, he stood slowly and looked down at Shadow. The German shepherd lifted his head and met his gaze calmly, the amber eyes clear and steady. For the first time since Thomas had begun visiting the cemetery, the dog glanced away from the grave, and looked toward the open gate at the far end of the path. It was a small movement, but it carried a quiet meaning. Thomas followed the direction of the dog's gaze, and then looked back again. "Your watch is finished, boy," he said softly. Shadow stood beside the grave for a final moment while the snow gathered along the pine branches overhead. Then, slowly and without hesitation, the German shepherd turned away from the headstone and stepped onto the narrow path that led toward the cemetery gate, leaving behind the place he had guarded with such silent devotion for so many months. Shadow moved down the narrow cemetery path with steady steps while the soft snowfall continued drifting across Silver Ridge Cemetery, the iron gate standing open ahead of him like the quiet beginning of something new. Thomas followed several yards behind, the small metal container held carefully in both hands as he watched the German shepherd walk forward for the first time since he had ever seen the animal near the grave. The dog's posture looked different now. The rigid stillness that had defined his watch beside the headstone had softened into something calmer, almost lighter, as though the invisible weight he had carried for months had finally been lifted. Snow settled along Shadow's back and the dark fur along his shoulders, yet he did not slow his pace. When he reached the gate, he paused briefly and turned his head toward the pine tree at the far edge of the cemetery where the grave of Michael Hayes rested beneath the quiet branches. For a moment the dog simply looked in that direction, his ears lifting slightly as the wind passed through the trees. Thomas stopped beside the gate and followed the dog's gaze across the rows of headstones. The cemetery looked peaceful beneath the thin blanket of snow, each stone standing silent and steady beneath the gray winter sky. It was the kind of quiet place where memories lingered longer than voices. Shadow held the moment for several seconds before finally turning his head back toward the road that stretched beyond the gate. Thomas stepped forward slowly and stood beside him, resting one hand gently on the dog's shoulder. The German shepherd did not pull away. Instead, he stood calmly, the warmth of his breath visible in the cold air. Thomas looked down at the container in his hands and then back toward the path ahead. He realized that whatever message Michael Hayes had left behind was not meant to stay buried in the ground forever. It had been meant to be found by someone who would understand the bond between a Marine and the dog who had served beside him. Shadow took a few more steps forward, leaving the gravel path of the cemetery and stepping onto the narrow road that curved through the open fields beyond the gate. Thomas walked with him now, the two moving quietly side by side while the snowfall grew slightly heavier. The surrounding hills were fading into the pale gray distance, the winter landscape stretching wide beneath the silent sky. After several yards, Shadow slowed again and looked up at Thomas, his amber eyes steady and clear. There was no confusion in the dog's expression and no sign of hesitation. If anything, there was a quiet trust, the same trust that must have once existed between him and the Marine whose name rested behind them among the pine trees. Thomas knelt beside him and opened the container once more, lifting the cloth pouch carefully and holding the two dog tags in his palm. The metal reflected the faint winter light, while the engraved names remained strong and readable despite the months beneath the soil. Thomas gently clipped the chain onto Shadow's collar beside the worn brass tag the dog had carried all this time. The small metal pieces rested against the leather with a soft metallic sound. Shadow stood still while Thomas finished fastening the chain. Then the dog lifted his head slightly, as if recognizing the familiar weight against his collar. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind passed through the open field, carrying the distant scent of snow and pine. Then Shadow turned toward the road ahead and began walking again. And this time Thomas followed not as a stranger in the cemetery, but as the next person entrusted with the quiet promise the loyal German shepherd had protected for so long. The road beyond the cemetery curved gently through open land where winter fields stretched wide beneath a pale sky, and Shadow walked along the edge of the gravel with steady confidence while Thomas kept pace beside him. Snow continued to fall in quiet, drifting flakes that softened the distant hills and blurred the outlines of fence posts scattered across the landscape. The world felt calm in that moment, the kind of calm that follows the closing of something long unfinished. Thomas glanced down at the German shepherd walking beside him and noticed the dog's ears turning slightly with each passing sound, alert but no longer burdened by the intense watchfulness he had carried beside the grave. The dog tags resting against Shadow's collar moved gently with each step, producing a faint metallic rhythm that echoed softly in the quiet air. Thomas had heard that sound before many years ago when he had served alongside working dogs during his time in the Marine Corps. It was the sound of a partnership, a reminder that no Marine ever truly walked alone when a canine partner stood beside him. After nearly half a mile, the road reached a small wooden bridge that crossed a narrow stream winding through the valley. The water moved slowly beneath a thin layer of forming ice, reflecting the pale winter light in soft silver ripples. Shadow slowed as he approached the bridge and stepped onto the wooden planks, pausing halfway across as if considering the path ahead. Thomas stopped beside him and rested one hand lightly against the railing. The valley opened wider beyond the bridge, revealing scattered ranch houses in the distance and a long stretch of road disappearing toward the horizon. Shadow lifted his head and breathed in deeply, the cold air carrying the scent of pine, distant smoke from wood-burning stoves, and the faint trace of other animals moving through the winter fields. For the first time since leaving the cemetery, the dog's tail lifted slightly, not high, but with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. Thomas watched the movement and felt a small smile form beneath the collar of his coat. The change in the dog was subtle, yet unmistakable. Shadow was no longer standing guard. He was moving forward. They crossed the bridge together and continued along the road until the outline of a small town appeared ahead, its water tower rising above the snow-covered rooftops. A few cars passed slowly along the highway beyond the fields, their tires humming softly against the pavement. The ordinary sounds of life felt almost surprising after the long quiet of the cemetery. Shadow stopped again near a wooden sign that marked the entrance to the town and looked back briefly toward the distant hills where the cemetery rested beneath the pine trees. Thomas followed the direction of the dog's gaze, but saw only the soft gray outline of the landscape fading into snowfall. Whatever chapter had ended there belonged to the past now. He knelt beside Shadow and rested a hand gently along the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the thick winter coat. The two dog tags rested quietly against the collar, their engraved names catching the faint light. Thomas spoke softly into the cold air, not as an order, but as a promise. He told the dog that wherever the road led next they would walk it together. Shadow listened for a moment and then turned his head forward again, the amber eyes calm and certain. Without hesitation, the German shepherd stepped onto the road leading into town, and Thomas rose to follow beside him as the snow continued falling across the quiet winter morning. The town appeared slowly through the falling snow, its quiet streets lined with small brick storefronts and wooden porches that carried the calm rhythm of a place where people had known each other for years. Shadow walked along the edge of the sidewalk beside Thomas, his paws leaving clear prints in the thin white layer that covered the ground. The metal dog tags resting against his collar moved softly with each step, the small sound almost lost beneath the gentle whisper of the wind. Thomas glanced down at the German shepherd as they passed the first row of buildings and noticed that people were beginning to look in their direction. A woman standing outside a bakery paused while sweeping the snow from her front step. A man filling his pickup truck with gas turned his head as the pair moved past the station. It was not unusual to see a dog walking beside someone in a town like this, but there was something about Shadow that drew quiet attention. Perhaps it was the steady confidence in the way he carried himself or the disciplined calm that reminded some of the older residents of working dogs they had seen years ago near military bases. Shadow stopped near the corner of the main street and lifted his nose slightly, breathing in the scents drifting through the cold air. The smell of fresh coffee floated from a small diner across the road, mixing with the faint warmth of bread baking in the nearby bakery. Somewhere farther down the street, a bell above a shop door rang as someone stepped inside to escape the cold. The town was waking slowly, unaware of the long journey that had brought the German shepherd and the quiet Marine veteran beside him to this place. Thomas noticed the way Shadow studied the street ahead with thoughtful focus, not anxious but curious in a calm and measured way. It was the look of an animal adjusting to a world that was suddenly larger than the narrow patch of ground he had guarded for so many months. Thomas knelt beside him near a wooden bench outside the diner and brushed a thin layer of snow from the dog's back. Shadow leaned slightly into the touch, the warmth of his body steady beneath the thick winter coat. The dog tags resting against the collar caught the pale morning light for a brief moment. the engraved names still clear despite everything they had been through. A man stepped out of the diner carrying a steaming cup of coffee and paused when he noticed the tags. He looked at Thomas and then down at Shadow with a respectful nod. No words were needed. In towns like this, people understood what those small metal tags represented. Thomas returned the nod quietly and stood again, resting one hand lightly along Shadow's shoulder. The street stretched ahead beneath the soft snowfall, leading past rows of quiet houses and toward the open road beyond the town limits. For a moment, Shadow looked down the length of the street and then glanced back toward Thomas. The dog's amber eyes carried the calm certainty that had guided him through months of silent watch beside the grave. Whatever path came next would not be walked alone. Thomas gave a small gesture forward with his hand, and Shadow began moving again with the same steady stride that had carried him through every step of the journey so far. Together they continued down the snow-covered street while the town slowly came to life around them. The quiet promise between Marine and dog now carried forward into the next chapter of the road ahead. The snowfall eased as the morning moved forward, leaving a thin white layer along the sidewalks and rooftops while the small town continued waking around them. Shadow walked beside Thomas with steady confidence, his paws pressing quiet patterns into the snow that covered the main street. The soft clink of the dog tags resting against his collar followed each step like a gentle reminder of the bond that had carried him through months of silent duty. Thomas noticed the way the German Shepherd observed everything with calm focus. The movement of people opening shop doors, the hum of a passing pickup truck, the faint laughter of two children crossing the street toward the school building down the block. Shadow's ears shifted with each sound, but his body remained relaxed, as though he was learning the rhythm of a new place after the long stillness beside the grave. They stopped near the entrance of a small diner where the warm glow of lights spilled onto the snowy sidewalk through wide front windows. Inside, a handful of early customers sat at the counter while steam rose gently from coffee cups resting in their hands. Thomas opened the door and a small bell chimed overhead, the warm air inside carrying the rich smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread. Shadow stepped in beside him without hesitation and sat quietly near a table as Thomas removed his coat. A waitress approached with a friendly smile that carried the familiar kindness of small-town hospitality. Her eyes moved briefly to the dog tags resting against Shadow's collar before returning to Thomas. There was no curiosity in her expression, only quiet understanding. Thomas ordered a cup of coffee and a simple breakfast while Shadow remained seated beside the table with calm discipline. The dog watched the room with gentle alertness but did not move or make a sound. A few of the customers glanced in their direction, nodding politely when they noticed the tags and the steady posture of the German Shepherd. One older man, wearing a faded Marine Corps cap, raised his coffee mug slightly toward Thomas in silent greeting. Thomas returned the gesture with a small nod of respect. When the food arrived, Thomas placed a small portion of scrambled eggs on a plate for Shadow, setting it gently on the floor beside him. The dog waited patiently until Thomas gave a quiet signal with his hand before lowering his head to eat. The simple moment carried the calm rhythm of partnership, the kind built through patience and trust rather than words. Outside the window, the snow had nearly stopped, leaving the street bright beneath the soft winter light. Thomas finished his coffee and looked down at the dog sitting beside him. Shadow's amber eyes met his with quiet steadiness, the same look that had once guided him through the long months beside the grave. Thomas reached down and rested a hand gently along the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the thick coat. The dog tags shifted softly against the collar as Shadow lifted his head. For the first time since the journey had begun, there was no question in the dog's posture and no lingering weight of unfinished duty. There was only calm readiness for whatever road waited ahead. Thomas stood and placed a few bills on the table before stepping back toward the door. Shadow rose beside him without hesitation, his paws moving quietly across the wooden floor as they stepped once again into the crisp winter air of the street outside. The road stretched ahead beneath the clear sky, and together they continued walking forward into the quiet morning of the town that had now become the beginning of their next chapter. The air outside the diner had turned brighter as the clouds thinned above the town, and the fresh snow along the sidewalks reflected the pale winter sunlight in a quiet glow. Shadow stepped onto the street beside Thomas with the same calm stride he had carried since leaving the cemetery, his ears turning slightly as the distant sounds of the town drifted through the crisp morning air. A delivery truck rumbled slowly past the corner, and somewhere farther down the block a shopkeeper raised a metal gate with a clattering echo that carried along the buildings. Shadow watched the movement with steady curiosity but remained close beside Thomas, the familiar sound of the dog tags gently touching against his collar with each step. The two walked along the length of the street until the buildings began to thin and the road widened toward the outskirts of town. Snow rested along the wooden fences that bordered the nearby fields, and the quiet hills beyond the town rose softly beneath the pale sky. Thomas slowed near a small park where a few bare trees stood beside a long wooden bench dusted with snow. He brushed the bench clear with his gloved hand and sat down for a moment, watching the road that stretched beyond the park toward the distant highway. Shadow settled beside him with a quiet sigh, lowering himself onto the snow-covered ground and resting comfortably near Thomas's boots. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The silence carried the peaceful rhythm of a moment that did not need words. Thomas studied the dog beside him, noticing the steady rise and fall of Shadow's breathing and the calm focus in the amber eyes that had watched over a grave for so many months. It was clear that the dog understood more than most people might expect. Shadow had followed a memory across time and distance, protecting a message that only he could guide someone to discover. Thomas reached down and rested his hand gently along the dog's neck, feeling the quiet warmth beneath the thick coat. The dog tags shifted slightly and caught the winter light as Shadow lifted his head. Thomas looked down at the names engraved in the metal and then back toward the hills where the cemetery stood hidden among the pine trees. The road ahead stretched open and quiet, waiting for whatever journey might come next. Shadow slowly rose from the ground and stood beside him, looking in the same direction as though he understood that the long chapter behind them had truly ended. Thomas stood as well and brushed the remaining snow from his coat. The two of them walked together toward the edge of the park where the road continued beyond the town limits. The air carried the distant sound of a passing train somewhere beyond the hills, its low whistle echoing across the valley. Shadow paused briefly at the end of the sidewalk and looked up at Thomas with calm certainty. The dog did not need commands or guidance. The path ahead was already clear in his steady gaze. Thomas gave a small nod and stepped forward beside him, the two moving down the quiet road together while the winter sun climbed slowly higher above the peaceful town behind them. The road beyond the park stretched quietly through the open valley while the winter sun climbed higher above the snow-covered hills, casting long pale light across the fields that surrounded the town. Shadow walked beside Thomas with steady confidence, his dark coat catching the soft glow of morning as the two moved along the narrow shoulder of the road. The town behind them had grown quieter again, the small sounds of daily life fading into the distance until only the wind and the distant call of a train whistle remained. For the first time since Thomas had discovered the German shepherd at the cemetery, the world felt wide and open again rather than fixed to a single place of waiting. Shadow slowed near a wooden fence where the road curved gently toward the hills and lifted his nose to the air, breathing in deeply as if studying the familiar scents carried across the valley. The smell of pine trees drifted faintly from the forests farther up the mountains, mixing with the cold scent of fresh snow and the quiet warmth of distant wood smoke rising from ranch houses scattered across the fields. Thomas paused beside the fence and rested his hands along the top rail, watching the open landscape in front of them. It had been a long time since he had stood somewhere without thinking about where he needed to go next. The calm presence of the German shepherd beside him seemed to make the moment feel steady and grounded in a way that words could not explain. Shadow stepped closer and stood quietly at his side, the two dog tags resting against the worn leather collar moving softly as he turned his head toward Thomas. The engraved names caught the sunlight for a brief second before settling again against the dog's chest. Thomas reached down and touched the metal lightly, feeling the small, cool weight beneath his fingers. He remembered the photograph inside the container, the image of Michael Hayes standing proudly beside the same German shepherd now watching the valley beside him. It was clear that the promise between them had not ended when the grave was filled with soil. It had simply been carried forward by the one partner who refused to forget. Shadow looked toward the distant hills once more, and then back toward the road that continued beyond the bend in the valley. His posture was calm, but purposeful, as though he understood that the journey they had begun together was leading somewhere meaningful. Thomas stepped away from the fence and brushed the light snow from his gloves. The road ahead was quiet and nearly empty, stretching through the open land with nothing to block the view of the mountains rising beyond the horizon. He took a slow breath of the cold winter air and gave a small gesture forward with his hand. Shadow responded immediately, stepping onto the road with the same steady confidence that had guided him through every step of the long watch beside the grave. The dog's ears lifted slightly as the wind passed across the valley, and the faint sound of the dog tags echoed softly with each step. Thomas walked beside him without hesitation, the two figures moving together across the quiet winter landscape, while the sun continued rising above the hills. Whatever story had begun beside the pine tree at the cemetery had now become something larger than a place of memory. It had become a path forward, carried by loyalty, trust, and the quiet understanding between a Marine and the dog who had never once forgotten his duty. The road carried them deeper into the valley where the snow thinned across the open fields and the winter sun rose slowly above the distant mountains, casting long golden light across the quiet land. Shadow walked beside Thomas with steady purpose, his paws pressing soft patterns into the melting snow while the two dog tags rested against his collar with a gentle metallic rhythm. The hills ahead were calm and wide beneath the pale sky, and for the first time since the long watch beside the grave the world no longer felt still or waiting. It felt alive again. Thomas followed the same road with a quiet sense of understanding that had grown stronger with every step they had taken together. The story that began beneath the pine tree at the cemetery had not ended with the uncovering of the hidden container or the discovery of the message Michael Hayes had left behind. It had simply moved forward into the open road, carried by the one partner who had refused to forget. Shadow slowed slightly as they reached the crest of a gentle hill overlooking the valley, and he paused there for a moment while the wind moved softly across the fields below. The dog lifted his head and looked toward the distant horizon where the mountains rose blue and quiet beneath the winter sky. Thomas stopped beside him and rested his hands along the top rail of an old wooden fence that followed the edge of the road. From this height the small town behind them looked peaceful and still, its rooftops dusted with snow and its narrow streets winding quietly between the buildings. Somewhere within that town the road they had walked together now carried the first steps of a new life neither of them had expected to find. Shadow glanced briefly back in that direction, his amber eyes calm and thoughtful, before turning forward once more toward the open valley. The dog tags shifted softly as he moved, the names engraved on the metal catching the light for a brief moment. Michael Hayes, Shadow. Two names connected not only by the chain that held them together, but by the promise that had carried the dog across months of silence and memory. Thomas reached down and rested a hand gently along the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath the thick coat. There was no need for commands and no need for words. The understanding between them had already formed through quiet steps along the road, and the shared knowledge of what loyalty truly meant. Some bonds were not broken by time or distance, or even by the stillness of a grave beneath a pine tree. They were carried forward by memory and trust until someone else stepped forward to continue the path. Shadow took a few calm steps ahead and paused again, looking back at Thomas with the same steady certainty that had guided him through every moment of the journey. Thomas nodded slightly and stepped forward beside him. Together, they continued walking down the quiet road as the winter sun climbed higher over the valley, their footprints stretching behind them across the snow. Far beyond the hills the world continued waiting with roads still unwritten and days still unfolding. And as the wind moved gently across the fields and the small sound of dog tags echoed with each step, it became clear that some stories do not end with a farewell at a grave. They continue quietly in the steady rhythm of loyalty, carried forward by those who remember and those who choose to walk beside them.